March 10th, 1945. Around 3 o'clock in the morning. Tokyo. Or rather, what was beneath Tokyo. Here, in the deep, cold darkness of the sewer, time had stopped, turning into a thick, endless torture of waiting. The water, icy and dense with ash and filth, came up to his chest. He clung to the slippery, rusty rungs of a ladder that reached upward into an impenetrable gloom that was once an exit to the world. His name was Kenji Tanaka, and he was 19 years old. Every few seconds his body was racked by a violent shudder. Not from fear, no. Fear had long since burned away, leaving behind only a dull, animal exhaustion. It was the cold. An all-pervading cold, seeping under his skin, into his bones, into his very soul. Overhead, through the cast-iron grate, he could see not a patch of night sky, but a crimson pulsating maw of hell. A relentless rain of red-hot embers and white ash fell, hissing as it dissolved into the black water by his face. Sometimes a larger ember would land on his cheek or hand, and he wouldn't even flinch, feeling only a short, almost imperceptible sting of pain against the backdrop of universal numbness. He was trapped between two hells, below, the icy, filthy water threatening to steal his last warmth. Above, a firestorm that had turned his city, his world, into a giant funeral pyre. He no longer knew how long he had been here. An hour? A day? An eternity? The sounds had merged into a single, monotonous, soul-shattering roar. The distant crackle of collapsing buildings, the howl of the fire wind, and something else. Something so terrible his brain refused to process it. It was a scream. Not the scream of one person. It was the howl of hundreds of thousands of people burning alive, merged into a single inhuman note of pure terror. Kenji squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the sound, but it penetrated through the bones of his skull, vibrated in the water, resonated in his teeth. He, a signals officer of the Imperial Army, trained to listen for and distinguish the faintest signals, was deafened by the last, most terrible message ever transmitted by the human race. The message of its own end. His fingers, white from cold and strain, began to slip from the rung. He knew that if he let go, he would drown, or the current would simply carry him away into the depths of this underground labyrinth, where he would become food for rats. But he had almost no strength left to hold on. He was at his limit, physically, morally, on the verge beyond which a man ceases to be a man and becomes just a piece of meat awaiting its end. And in that moment, as his consciousness began to fade, he looked up at the crimson square of hell and asked himself the one and only question that still mattered. How did he get here? How had he, Kenji Tanaka, who just yesterday morning had been polishing his boots and dreaming of a bowl of hot rice, become this trembling creature, trapped in a tomb beneath a burning world? But to understand how the young signals officer came to be buried alive beneath the ashes of the greatest fire in human history, we must go back just a few hours, to that very evening when Tokyo still had a sky, and not a dome of fire. March 9th, 1945, 10 o'clock at night. The Fukagawa district, on the eastern outskirts of Tokyo. The air was cool and damp with the feel of spring. It smelled of coal from home stoves, salt water from the nearby bay, and the faint, elusive fragrance of early sakura. It was a world of contrasts, a world of paper walls and concrete pillboxes, of ancient traditions, and a new, total war. Kenji Tanaka sat at his post in a small headquarters, converted from an old warehouse. A dim bulb hanging from the ceiling cast a flickering light on his focused face, and the complex web of wires running into the wall. The ether crackled in his headphones, full of static and distant, unintelligible voices. The work of a signals officer was nerve-wracking, demanding absolute concentration. He was the Army's ear, the thinnest thread connecting the scattered parts of a vast fighting organism. Lives depended on his speed and accuracy, and 19-year-old Kenji approached his duty with fanatical devotion. He was a soldier of the Emperor, and that filled his existence with meaning. Tonight seemed deceptively quiet. For the past few weeks, American B-29 bombers, those silver flying fortresses, had appeared over the city almost every day. But they flew high, very high, and dropped conventional high-explosive bombs. They destroyed factories and military installations, but left residential areas almost untouched. People had gotten used to them. Used to the wail of the sirens, the shaking of the ground, the need to go out and clear rubble after the all-clear sounded. The war had become routine. A heavy, terrifying routine, but a routine nonetheless. That evening, Kenji thought of home, of his mother in a small village near Kyoto. He remembered her calloused hands always smelling of earth and rice, her quiet smile. He replayed her last words from a letter he had received a week ago. "Take care of yourself, my son, and remember that the spirits of our ancestors are always with you." He touched the small silk pouch, an omamori that hung around his neck, a talisman from the temple she had given him before he left for the army. It was his anchor in this raging ocean of war. Somewhere beyond the wall a door creaked, followed by muffled voices. His commander, Lieutenant Sato, was gloomier than usual today. He had spent the entire day studying some reports, and his face had hardened into an emotionless mask. "Something is coming, Tanaka," he had said earlier that day. "The Americans are up to something. There's trouble in the air." Kenji had only nodded respectfully then. He had learned to trust the old officer's intuition. At about 10:30 p.m. a new sound came through the headphones. Not the crackle of static. It was a distant, low, vibrating hum, barely perceptible like the buzzing of a faraway beehive. But Kenji, trained by thousands of hours of listening to the ether, recognized it immediately. It was the sound of B-29 engines. But it was different, denser, more massive. As if it wasn't a single squadron in the sky, but an entire armada. He reported to the lieutenant. Sato only sighed heavily and looked out the window at the dark sky. "It's starting," he whispered. A few minutes later, the sirens began to wail, a long, soul-tearing sound that had become the soundtrack of their lives. But even it sounded different today. It lacked its usual intermittent pattern. It howled continuously, like a maddened beast sensing its own doom. Kenji remained at his post, receiving and transmitting short, clipped orders. Air defense posts were reporting a massive group of approaching aircraft. Hundreds. An unprecedented number. And they were flying low. Very low. It was suicidal. Japanese anti-aircraft guns and night fighters could easily reach them. Why were they doing this? The answer came half an hour later. The first strike didn't hit their district, but a little to the north, in Asakusa. The horizon was suddenly illuminated not by the flashes of explosions, but by a steady, eerie orange glow, as if a second sick sun had risen there. And then the wind reached them. A warm, gusty wind, carrying a smell Kenji had never experienced before. The smell of a burning city. A city burning in its entirety. Burning houses, trees, people. Lieutenant Sato burst into the room. In his hand, he held an encrypted dispatch. "Tanaka!" His voice was as hard as steel. "This is for district headquarters. Immediately! This is a top priority order!" Kenji jumped up and took the packet. He knew what this meant. The wire communications were likely already cut. He would have to run. Run through the hell that was unfolding right before their eyes. He ran outside and froze. The world he had known just half an hour ago no longer existed. The sky was black and red. It wasn't rain falling from it. It was thousands of small, hissing cylinders. They struck the wooden roofs of the houses, the pavement, and burst, spattering a thick, burning liquid in all directions. Napalm. The city, built of wood and paper, ignited like a matchbox. A few moments later, Kenji realized that the thudding he heard was not the sound of enemy bombs hitting the ground. It was the sound of his own heart beating out the last peaceful seconds of his life. An impact. And another right after it. And another. These were not the deafening explosions of high-explosive bombs he had almost grown used to. These were hundreds, thousands of dull, wet thuds, as if a giant hailstorm of fire had descended upon his world. Kenji grabbed the dispatch pouch, checked that it was securely fastened, and bolted out of the headquarters building. What he saw defied description. The street, which just minutes ago had been dark and quiet, had turned into the threshold of hell. The houses on both sides weren't just burning, they were exploding with fire from within. Paper shoji screens and wooden frames flared up like straw. The burning liquid, napalm, flowed down the tiled roofs, dripped onto the ground, forming rivers of fire that spread with a hiss through the narrow lanes. The air instantly became hot, thick, and painful to breathe. It scorched his lungs, his palate, his eyes. Incendiary bombs continued to fall from the sky, and Kenji ran, instinctively ducking, dodging the fiery rain. He had to deliver the dispatch. That was his mission, his duty. Nothing else mattered. People ran from their burning homes. Their clothes were smoldering, their hair on fire. They were screaming. Oh gods, how they screamed. Kenji saw a woman with a child in her arms, her kimono engulfed in flames. She ran without a sound, her mouth wide open, a trail of black smoke behind her. He saw an old man trying to put out the fire on his house with a bucket of water, but the water just sizzled and evaporated, and the fire only grew stronger. The chaos was absolute. The panic was all-consuming. But Kenji ran. His soldier's training overrode his primal terror. He didn't look to the sides. He looked only forward, searching for a path through the burning rubble. He knew the route to the district headquarters by heart. 2 blocks straight, then left, across a small bridge over the canal, and another 500 meters, roughly about 640 feet. Simple. But now that path had become an obstacle course designed by the devil himself. Suddenly, he realized a wind had picked up. A strong, gusty, hot wind. It wasn't blowing from the bay. It was blowing from everywhere at once, twisting into fiery vortexes. It was a firestorm. The temperature difference between the heart of the fire and the surrounding atmosphere was creating a draft of incredible power. The wind uprooted trees, tore roofs from houses, and hurled them burning onto other buildings. It snatched people up and threw them into the fire. Kenji saw it happen. A man running ahead of him was caught by such a vortex, spun around, and thrown into a wall of flame. He vanished instantly, leaving behind only a short, cut-off scream. Kenji dropped to the ground, pressing himself against the pavement, which was already hot. The wind roared over him like a wounded beast. He understood that running through the streets was certain death. He had to find shelter. But where? Everything was burning. There were almost no concrete buildings in this area. Everything was built of wood and paper, which had served the Japanese as homes for centuries and had now become their death trap. He raised his head. Ahead, about 20 meters, around 65 feet away, he saw what he was looking for. An open sewer manhole. Workers had probably been doing some repairs and hadn't had time to close it before the raid began. A black round opening in the ground. An entrance to another world. A world of darkness and cold. The stench from it was terrible, but right now it smelled like salvation. He scrambled to his feet and ran, not feeling the soles of his boots melting beneath him. The fire was closing in. The air was growing thinner, making it almost impossible to breathe. He reached the manhole. Behind him, a 2-story house collapsed with a deafening crash, blocking the street with a wall of fire. There was no way back. He didn't hesitate for a second. Clutching the dispatch pouch tightly, he jumped down into the saving darkness. He looked at his terrified, horror-stricken fellow citizens, scrambling in the fiery trap, then at the black, saving maw at his feet. And in that moment, he understood. If he wanted to survive, he had to become not just a soldier running with a dispatch, but a creature willing to descend into hell to avoid burning in it. The impact with the icy, viscous sludge was a shock. For one brief moment he lost his breath, submerged headfirst in the foul-smelling darkness. The water was chest-deep, and its cold was so intense it felt like a burn, the complete opposite of the fiery inferno he had just escaped. He surfaced, spitting and gasping for air. The air down here was heavy, stale, smelling of filth, rot, and dampness, but it had oxygen. That was what mattered. Overhead, in the round opening of the manhole, a firestorm raged. Crimson reflections danced on the concrete walls of the sewer, creating bizarre, frightening shadows. He saw burning debris fly past, heard the ceaseless howl of the flames. Then the heavy cast-iron manhole cover, thrown by the blast wave from a nearby collapsing building, shifted and slid into place with a deafening scrape and clang, almost completely blocking the exit. Only a thin crack remained, through which a dim, bloody light filtered, and ash continued to fall. Near total darkness fell, and silence. No, not silence. The sounds just changed. The roar of the fire grew muffled as if coming from far away from behind a thick wall. But now Kenji began to hear other sounds, the sounds of his new world. The steady drip of water from the walls, the quiet viscous current that was pulling him deeper into the tunnel. And a squeaking. Hundreds, thousands of thin, barely audible squeaks coming from all around. Rats. They were escaping the fire just like him. He was in their kingdom. For the first few minutes he just stood there, trying to process what had happened. Shock gave way to animal terror. He was trapped, locked underground, alone, in the dark, with rats. And above, his city was burning. And then he heard the screams. They seeped through the earth, through the concrete, through the water. Muffled, distorted. They sounded like the moans of the earth itself. These were the screams of people, those who hadn't made it, who were caught in the fiery trap. He covered his ears with his hands, but it didn't help. The sound came from within, resonating with his own terror. He pictured the woman with the child, the old man with the bucket. He pictured his comrades at headquarters, Lieutenant Sato. They were all up there. He tried not to think about it, but his mind helpfully painted one horrifying picture after another. He had to do something, or he would go insane. He began to move, slowly, by feel, with one hand outstretched. The current was not strong, but it was constant. The water was full of some kind of debris that snagged at his legs. He walked against the current, instinctively understanding that to go with it meant moving further away from where he had descended, deeper into the unknown of this subterranean world. The walls were slippery, covered in a disgusting slime. He slipped several times and nearly went under completely. The dispatch pouch was an encumbrance, but he couldn't abandon it. It was his mission. It was his last anchor connecting him to who he had been before this moment, a soldier of the Imperial Army. Suddenly his hand met not a wall, but emptiness. A side tunnel, narrower than the main one. He froze, listening. A more intense rustling and squeaking came from there. He realized it was a rat's nest or their migration path. He recoiled and continued along the main sewer. How long did he walk like this? An hour? 2? He lost all track of time. His body began to stiffen from the cold. His teeth chattered. He knew he wouldn't last long in the icy water. Hypothermia would kill him before hunger or thirst. He needed to find a place to get out of the water, even for a few inches, to rest, to get warm. But all around were only smooth, wet walls. Hope began to fade, replaced by a dull despair. He stopped, leaning his back against the cold concrete. And then he felt it. A vibration. Strong. Growing. It was coming from above, through the ground. It felt like an earthquake. And then came a deafening, prolonged roar. The building directly above him collapsed. Dust and small stones rained down from the sewer ceiling. The water at his feet surged. He froze, expecting the tunnel's vault to give way and bury him alive. But the tunnel held. The Americans had built Tokyo's sewers to last. When the roaring subsided, he realized that the screams from above had stopped. A dead silence fell, broken only by the hum of the distant fire. Everyone who had been in that building was now silent forever. And in that dead silence, he understood the full scale of the catastrophe. This was not just a bombing. It was an annihilation, and he was its sole, unseen witness, locked in a concrete coffin. His strength was running out. He knew he only had a few hours left on his feet. It seemed it was all over. But just then, when he was ready to give up, his foot hit something hard and wide under the water. It was an uneven but stable platform. He began to carefully feel the discovery with his feet, afraid it was just a large piece of debris that the current would sweep away. But no, the base was solid. It was some kind of ledge, perhaps part of the foundation of an older sewer line, or simply an island of refuse washed up over decades, compressed by time into a semblance of stone. It was only a few inches above the water level, but it was salvation. It was his continent, his promised land in the middle of an icy ocean of despair. Gathering his last strength, Kenji hauled himself out of the water. He sat, tucking his numb legs under him. His clothes were soaked through and heavy. The cold did not retreat. In fact, in the draft that blew through the tunnel, it felt even colder. But he was out of the water. That was the main thing. It was his first small victory. He sat in complete darkness, broken only by the dim red glow from the distant manhole, and tried to warm himself by rubbing his hands and feet. His body was shaking with a violent tremor. He took off his soaked tunic, wrung it out as best he could, and put it back on. It didn't help much, but it gave him something to do. A purpose. He began to explore his island. By touch it felt small, about 2 meters long and 1 meter wide. The surface was uneven, covered in a layer of silt and some disgusting slime. He felt something hard and long. It turned out to be a piece of rusted rebar. He took it in his hand. It was a weapon. Simple, primitive, but a weapon. Against whom? He didn't know yet, but his soldier's instinct told him that in this world, one couldn't be without a weapon. And then he heard them. They were very close. A rustling, a squeaking, the clicking of tiny claws on concrete. The rats. His island was not just his discovery. They were also taking refuge here from the rising water. Dozens of tiny red lights gleamed in the darkness. Their eyes. They were watching him. They were waiting. They could sense he was weak. He was an intruder who had invaded their territory. Kenji gripped the rebar tighter. He realized he was facing another battle. A battle not for a city, not for the Emperor. A battle for this tiny, stinking piece of trash in the middle of a sewer. A battle for the right to live. The first rat charged him. It was large, brazen, obviously the leader. He saw its silhouette in the dim light. It leaped, aiming for his face. He reflexively swung the rebar. There was a dull thud and a sickening wet crunch. The squeaking stopped abruptly. The pack froze for a moment. They hadn't expected resistance. Kenji was breathing heavily. He felt sick from what he had just done. He had never killed like this, up close, feeling the bones of a living creature break. But disgust gave way to fury. This was his land. He would not give it up. He stood, as much as the tunnel's height allowed, and took a few steps forward, striking the rebar on the concrete in front of him. The sound echoed loudly through the tunnel, scaring the rats. They retreated, disappearing into the shadows, but they did not leave. They were watching, waiting for him to weaken again. Kenji knew this would be a war of attrition. He returned to the center of his island and sat down, his back against the wall. He couldn't afford to sleep. He couldn't afford to relax for a second. He had won the first battle, but the smell of fresh blood had attracted the attention of the other inhabitants of this abyss, those who were even hungrier and more numerous. The victory over the rat leader gave him something more than just a patch of dry land. It gave him back his will. It reminded him that he was a soldier, and a soldier must fight, no matter where or against whom. The enemy could be an American Marine on a Pacific island or a gray rat in a Tokyo sewer. The essence of the fight does not change. He began to organize his defense. He realized that just sitting and waiting was a path to defeat. He needed a system, order, created from chaos. This is what the army had taught him. First, he explored his island more thoroughly, inch by inch. He found a few more useful items, a scrap of some canvas fabric, half buried in the silt, and an empty glass bottle. He managed to pull out the canvas with difficulty. The fabric was slimy and foul-smelling but strong. He spread it out, creating a sort of mat for himself which insulated him from the wet, cold debris. It was a small luxury, but it had immense psychological value. He was no longer sitting in filth. He had his own home. The bottle became his second weapon and tool. He could use it to scoop up water, though he dared not drink it, or by breaking it, turn it into a sharp blade. But most importantly, he could bang it against the wall, creating a noise that scared the rats away. He established a defensive perimeter. He lined the edges of his island with the largest and hardest pieces of debris he could find underwater, creating a low barrier. It was more of a psychological than a physical obstacle, but it marked his territory. This was his border, his empire. Then he began to tackle the most difficult problem, the problem of time. In absolute darkness, without a clock, without the change of day and night, it was very easy to lose one's mind, to fall into a state of timelessness. He needed a way to count the hours, the days. He again turned to his experience as a signals officer. He was used to living on a strict schedule where every minute counted. He began to keep his own internal time. He decided he would count to 3,600, roughly an hour. After each such hour, he would make a small notch on the silty wall with his piece of rebar. It was exhausting. It required colossal concentration, but it kept his brain from shutting down, from sinking into apathy. This was his daily routine. 1 hour he dedicated to watching the rats and reinforcing his barricades. The next hour he tried to do something like physical exercises, as space allowed, stretching his stiff muscles, doing squats to get his blood flowing and warm up a little. The third hour he would rest, but not sleep. He would sit motionless, listening to the sounds of the sewer, and try to meditate, to clear his mind of fear and despair. He remembered his training in the dojo, the breathing exercises. He had turned his prison into his personal monastery. He became the ruler of his tiny state. He had territory, a capital, the piece of canvas, an army of one soldier, himself, and even his own economy, based on the strictest conservation of energy. He had found a fragile but stable existence. He was no longer just a victim. He was a survivor. He had created his system, his order in the midst of absolute chaos. He even learned to distinguish the sounds coming from above. The dull, distant roar of the fire never ceased. Sometimes there were loud crashes, large buildings collapsing, unable to withstand the heat. Each such impact sent a tremor through the walls of his shelter. He began to create a map of the destruction in his mind, imagining which districts of the city were disappearing one by one. His underground world gave him not only physical shelter, but also psychological protection. Down here, he was safe. Down here, he was king. He almost got used to this existence. He almost forgot about the world above. He had created his own civilization from mud and debris, and it worked. But his growing organization and stability could not last forever. And an internal enemy, far more terrifying than the rats, was already preparing to strike. In the darkness of his own mind, a rebellion was brewing. For the first few cycles, his system worked flawlessly. The rhythm, the discipline, the constant activity, all of it built a strong wall protecting his sanity from the madness lurking in the dark. But the human mind is not a machine. It cannot be kept in a state of extreme concentration forever. Sooner or later it fails. It started with fatigue. Physical exhaustion was compounded by nervous strain. His body demanded sleep, real, deep sleep, not the anxious half-consciousness he allowed himself for a few minutes at a time. And it was during these brief lapses into unconsciousness that they began to come. The hallucinations. At first, it was just sounds. He started to think he could hear voices in the crackle of the ether in his imaginary headphones. The voice of Lieutenant Sato giving orders. His mother's voice, calling his name. He knew it was a trick of the mind, but the sounds were frighteningly real. He would shake his head, try to focus on counting, but the voices would return, growing more insistent. Then came the images. In the dancing reflections of the distant fire on the wet wall, he began to see faces. Faces distorted by pain and terror. The faces of the people he had seen on the streets in the final moments before his jump. The woman with the child. Her eyes full of fire and a silent question. Why did you survive, and not us? He would squeeze his eyes shut, but the images were seared onto the inside of his eyelids. They were with him. They became his constant, silent companions in this hell. But the most terrifying enemy took the form of himself. An inner voice, the voice of despair. It began to whisper to him in moments when his will weakened. What's the point of all this? It would say. Why this struggle? Look at yourself. You're sitting in filth, in darkness, fighting rats for a piece of trash. And there's nothing left up there. Your city is burned. Your friends, your family, they're all dead. Your dispatch is useless. Your mission has failed. Kenji tried to argue with this voice. He told himself he was a soldier, that he had to survive to do his duty. But the voice of despair was cunning. Duty, it laughed. Your duty was to die up there with everyone else. You're a coward. You ran. You hid underground like a rat. You betrayed them all. These words were poison. They seeped into the deepest corners of his soul, poisoning his resolve. He began to doubt. Maybe it really was all meaningless. Maybe it would be easier to just lie down in the icy water and let it take him, to end this torment. He stopped counting. He stopped exercising. He just sat, hugging his knees, and stared into the darkness, listening to the venomous whisper in his head. The rats, sensing his weakness, grew bolder. They started to approach his island again, their red eyes glowing like embers in the dark. He didn't even try to shoo them away. He didn't care anymore. He was broken. The antagonist from within, his own despair, had almost won. He was ready to take the final step, to slide off his life-saving island into the cold embrace of the water. He looked at his hand, which still clutched the piece of rebar. His weapon, his scepter of power in this subterranean kingdom. And then he saw it. On his ring finger, under a layer of grime, a simple copper ring gleamed dully, the ring his mother had given him. This isn't for wealth, she'd said then. It's so you remember you are not alone, that we are always waiting for you. He brought his hand to his face. He'd almost forgotten about the ring. He began to rub it with the sleeve of his wet tunic, wiping away the dirt. And in that moment he heard his mother's voice. But it wasn't the hallucinatory, accusing whisper. It was her real, warm, loving voice, which he kept in his memory. Live, Kenji, memory whispered. Just live. Something inside him switched, as if the ice that had bound his soul cracked. No, he would not give up. He would live. For her. So that one day, when all this was over, he could return and tell her he had survived. He was not a traitor. He was her son. Rage, pure, primal rage, displaced despair. He jumped to his feet. He let out a cry, not a cry of terror. A cry of a warrior charging into battle. He threw himself at the rats, swinging his rebar. He wasn't just chasing them away, he was attacking. He drove them from his land, deep into the dark tunnels. The pack, not expecting such fury from a seemingly broken creature, scattered in panic. He had upheld his law. The rebellion had been crushed. But while he was fighting the demons in his own head, he hadn't noticed that his real enemy, impersonal and far more powerful, was preparing its final, devastating blow. He stood in the middle of his island, breathing heavily. The internal enemy was defeated. The demons had retreated. He was once again the master of his fate, of his tiny world. He returned to his ritual. He resumed counting, made several notches on the wall to catch up on lost time. He felt like a soldier again. He had survived the fire. He had survived the water. He had survived the rats and his own madness. It seemed the worst was over. He even allowed himself a faint, fragile hope. Maybe the fire above had subsided. Maybe they would start looking for him soon. He had to be ready. He checked the dispatch pouch. It was there, soaked. But the contents, protected by several layers of oiled paper, should have survived. And in that moment, the earth shuddered again. But this was not the vibration he was used to. It was not the rumble of a distant building collapsing. It was a powerful, crushing impact somewhere very close, perhaps directly above him. The tunnel vault creaked. Chunks of concrete rained from the ceiling, one of which hit him hard on the shoulder. He fell onto his canvas, covering his head with his arms. The roar was deafening, lasting for several seconds that felt like an eternity. Then, everything fell silent. He cautiously raised his head. The tunnel had held. But something had changed. He heard a new sound. A powerful, growing roar and splash. He looked in the direction the current was coming from, and his heart froze. The water level was rising. Fast. Very fast. Apparently, the impact above had damaged a main city water pipe, and now thousands of cubic meters of water were pouring into the sewer system. His island, his saving grace, began to disappear rapidly underwater. The water now covered his canvas. Now it touched his boots. A minute later, it was up to his ankles. Another minute, his knees. He stood in the middle of his sinking kingdom, and the icy terror he thought he had conquered once again seized his heart in a vice. There was nowhere to run. The current was getting stronger, knocking him off his feet. The water carried new debris, fragments of planks, some household items washed out from ruined basements. This was the end, the real end. He had survived the fire only to drown in filth. The irony was cruel. The rush of water swept him off his feet. He was plunged into the icy, churning chaos. He was slammed against a wall, then spun around and dragged into the depths of the tunnel, into the impenetrable darkness he had so feared. The dispatch pouch was ripped from his shoulder, but he managed to grab it at the last moment. He couldn't lose it. It was all he had left of his past life. He struggled, tried to swim, but the current was too strong. His head kept going under. He swallowed the filthy liquid. His lungs burned. He was a splinter in this subterranean flood. And when his strength was nearly gone, when he was ready to uncurl his fingers and let go of the pouch, let go of life itself, he remembered. He remembered that when he was walking here, at the very beginning, he had seen something in the wall that he hadn't paid proper attention to then. A metal ladder going up to a ventilation shaft. He didn't know where it led. Maybe it ended in a sealed grate. Maybe it was blocked by rubble. But it was a chance. The only one. He was somewhere in that area. If he could just get to the wall, if he could grab onto it. He began to paddle desperately toward the side, fighting the current that was pulling him forward. Every stroke drained his remaining strength. His muscles burned. His lungs were bursting for air. The darkness before his eyes began to thicken, turning from an absence of light into a physical, crushing presence. He had lost. He was dying. And it was at that exact moment that his outstretched hand touched something cold and metallic. A rung. The ladder. He latched onto it with a death grip. The current immediately tugged at his body, trying to tear him away, to drag him further, but he held on. He pulled himself up, found the next rung with his feet. He was safe. For a moment. The water continued to rise. It was already up to his waist, then his chest. He began to climb upward, moving his numb hands and feet with his last ounce of strength. The rungs were slippery, rusty. He slipped several times but held on. He climbed up into the darkness, not knowing what awaited him. He just climbed because moving up was life, and everything else was death. Finally, his head hit something hard. A grate. The end of the line. He pushed it. It wouldn't budge. He hit it with his shoulder. Same result. Despair began to creep in again. But then he noticed a faint gray light filtering through the bars. Not the red glow of the fire. A dim, lifeless, but daylight glow. And he heard a sound. Faint, barely perceptible. The sound of wind. Real wind. Not the fiery monster that had raged here before. He was alive. He was almost at the surface. The price of this victory was terrible. He was on the verge of complete exhaustion, but he was alive. And in that moment, in the relative quiet that had fallen, he realized there were no more screams. The city had fallen silent. And that soundless scream was more terrifying than anything he had heard before. He hung from the ladder, his cheek pressed against the cold, wet grate. The gray light filtering through it seemed the most beautiful sight of his life. He greedily inhaled the air seeping through the gaps. It still smelled of burning, but it was the smell of a cooling conflagration, not a raging inferno. It was the smell of death, but also the smell of a battle's end. He rested, gathering the last crumbs of his strength. He didn't know how long he hung there. Maybe 10 minutes, maybe an hour. Time had lost its meaning again. All that mattered was the next step. He tried to push the grate again. This time he acted not in panic, but methodically. He braced his feet on the rungs, tensed every muscle in his back and shoulders, and pushed. A deafening screech of rusted metal echoed. The grate, weighed down by some debris and ash from above, shifted a few centimeters. It was enough. He slid his fingers into the gap and pulled. Slowly, with incredible effort, he managed to move it further. An opening large enough for him to squeeze through was formed. He pulled himself up one last time, swung over the edge, and fell onto a hard surface, gasping for breath. He had done it. He was out. He was saved. He lay on his stomach, unable to move, and kissed the ground, which was covered in a thick layer of fine gray ash. He was laughing and crying at the same time. Strange gurgling sounds escaped his chest. The euphoria of salvation was all-consuming. He had survived. He had won. After a few minutes, when the first wave of joy passed, he sat up and looked around, and the euphoria was instantly replaced by shock. A shock so deep, so absolute, that everything he had endured before seemed like a child's nightmare. He was sitting in the middle of a vast, endless desert. A desert of ash. As far as the eye could see, everything was covered in a uniform gray layer. Not a single house, not a single tree, not a single utility pole. Nothing. Only occasionally the lone, blackened skeletons of concrete buildings protruded from the ash, like tombstones in a giant cemetery. The sky was shrouded in a gray haze through which the sun shone dimly, like a murky, lifeless disk. And the silence. An absolute dead silence. There were no birds singing, no dogs barking, no car horns, no human voices. Only the quiet, mournful howl of the wind as it shifted the ash from place to place, creating small, gray whirlwinds. His city, his world, was gone. It had been wiped from the face of the earth. Kenji slowly got to his feet. He swayed. He looked like a ghost in his dirty, tattered uniform, his face smeared with soot and silt. He looked at his hands. They were trembling. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. This couldn't be real. It was a dream. A nightmare from which he was about to wake up. He took a few steps. The ash crunched under his feet. He stumbled on something hard. He cleared the ash with his foot. It was the melted frame of a bicycle. Next to it lay something else. Something black, formless. He looked closer and recoiled. It was a person, or what was left of one. A charred, contorted mannequin frozen in a posture of agony. He looked around more carefully, and now he saw them. They were everywhere. Dozens, hundreds, thousands. Some lay alone, some in groups, huddled together in a last, desperate attempt to protect one another. They lay in the very poses in which death had found them, running, sitting, hugging their children. The firestorm hadn't just burned them. It had vaporized all the moisture from their bodies, leaving only blackened, shrunken mummies. It was a sight so monstrous that the human mind refused to comprehend it. There was no blood. There were no wounds. There was only quiet, gray, endless death. Kenji realized he wasn't saved. He had merely passed from one circle of hell to another, the final one. The hell of fire and water had been replaced by the hell of silence and ash. He was Robinson Crusoe on an island of the dead. He was the last man in a destroyed world. He stood in the midst of this wasteland, and tears streamed down his dirty cheeks, leaving clean tracks. But he wasn't crying from grief, nor from horror. He was crying from a monstrous, unbearable loneliness. His feat, his incredible struggle for life underground, meant nothing up here. He was just another survivor, one of the few, and his salvation was his ultimate punishment. He walked. He didn't know where. He just walked, putting one foot in front of the other, his legs feeling like they belonged to someone else. The world around him was monochromatic, devoid of color, sound, and life. Gray sky, gray earth, gray remains of people. He was the only moving object in this giant, frozen photograph of death. His internal compass, his knowledge of his hometown streets, was useless. All landmarks had vanished. He tried to find his headquarters, but in its place was only a flat field of ash, with a melted pipe sticking out of it. He walked for several hours, and in all that time he did not meet a single living soul. Only bodies, bodies, and more bodies. They lay by dried-up wells where they had thrown themselves hoping to escape the fire. They lay in swimming pools where the water had simply boiled, cooking them alive. He saw things a man should never see, and with every step, his soul was coated in the same gray ash as the earth beneath his feet. At last, he saw movement. In the distance, through the gray haze, some figures were moving. They walked slowly, staggering, just like him. Other survivors. He walked toward them, and a faint hope stirred in his chest. He was not alone. But as he got closer, he realized these people were ghosts, just like him. Their faces were blank, their eyes expressionless. They didn't speak to each other. They just wandered, each lost in their own personal hell. He tried to speak to one of them, an old man in scorched clothes. "What happened here?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. The old man looked at him with cloudy, unseeing eyes, said nothing and shuffled on. No one asked questions. No one cried. Emotions had burned away with the city. All that was left was shock and a dull, animalistic urge to keep moving. By evening he reached the Sumida River, and there he saw the most horrific sight of all. The bridge was clogged with bodies. People had tried to cross to the other side, but the firestorm had caught them right there. They were frozen in place, fused into a single baked mass. And the river itself was full of bodies. Thousands had thrown themselves into the water to escape the flames, only to die from suffocation or simply drown. Kenji found his dispatch pouch still with him. He took out the packet. It was wet but sealed. He thought of Lieutenant Sato, of his orders, and he realized the utter pointlessness of it all. The headquarters was gone. The army in this area was gone. His mission had lost all meaning. He was a soldier without a war, a signals officer without a signal, a man without a world. He uncurled his fingers, and the packet fell into the gray water of the river, slowly sinking to the bottom. With it, his past life sank as well. He spent several days wandering the ruins before he and the other survivors were found by rescue teams. They fed him, gave him first aid. An officer from the military police interrogated him. Kenji told him everything about the order, the firestorm, the manhole, the sewer, the 2 days in darkness. The officer listened with a stone face, taking notes in a small book. When Kenji finished, he looked at him and said, "Signalman Tanaka, you are suffering from severe combat shock. Your testimony is incoherent and the product of a shell-shocked imagination. You deserted your post in the face of the enemy. But given the extraordinary circumstances, we will not court-martial you. You will be sent to a hospital and then discharged. The war is over for you." And Kenji understood. They didn't believe him. His story was too incredible, too insane. It was easier to blame it on shock, easier to declare him a deserter, albeit a forgiven one. His ordeal, his personal odyssey into hell, had been erased, buried under an official diagnosis. He didn't argue. He just nodded. After the hospital, he returned to his village. His mother was alive. She embraced him, and for the first time in a long time, he wept. He never told her what had happened to him, nor did he tell anyone else. He lived a quiet, unremarkable life. He worked in the rice paddies. He married. He had children. But every night he had the same dream. He was back down there, in the cold, dark water, hearing the screams of a burning city. Sometimes, on rainy days, he would walk to an open sewer manhole on the village street and stare down into the darkness for a long time. His children would ask what he was looking for. He would just smile and reply, "I'm just checking to see if everything is all right in my old kingdom." He died at a ripe old age, surrounded by his grandchildren. A quiet, humble old man who no one would have ever guessed had lived through the apocalypse, locked in its epicenter. Official reports on the bombing of Tokyo on March 10, 1945, are full of numbers. 334 B-29 bombers, 1,665 tons of incendiary bombs, 16 square miles of scorched earth, over 100,000 dead in a single night. More than died on the first day in Hiroshima or Nagasaki. But behind these dry, terrible numbers lie thousands of stories. Stories that were never written down. Stories that the official record deemed too incredible, too inconvenient, or simply insignificant. The story of Signalman Kenji Tanaka is one of them. His name cannot be found in military archives. His feat is not mentioned on any award lists. His unbelievable survival was written off as combat shock, the hallucinations of a soldier who couldn't bear the horror of war. The system he so loyally served refused to believe his truth. It buried his story alive, just as he himself had been buried underground. But stories like this do not disappear without a trace. They become part of the people's memory. They become legends. Among those who survived the fiery hell of the Fukagawa district, a belief lingered for a long time. It was said that in the most terrible hour, when earth and sky merged in fire, strange, silent people would emerge from beneath the ground. They would come out of sewer manholes, covered in silt and grime, with empty eyes, and silently help the wounded before disappearing just as silently into the ruins. They were called the people from under the ground, the spirits of the sewers. No one knew who they were or where they came from. Were they real people, like Kenji? Or just a product of collective grief? A desperate attempt to find hope and a miracle in the midst of an absolute nightmare? We will never know. The legend of the man who survived the end of the world at its epicenter, who did not see it but only heard and felt it, became part of Tokyo's unwritten history. A story that proves that even when the world collapses and turns to ash, the human spirit can find shelter in the darkest and deepest corners, create its own empire from refuse and despair, and survive to tell the tale, even if no one believes the telling. This story is not just a chronicle of a forgotten feat. It is a reminder that the most terrible battles of World War II were not fought on battlefields, but in the souls of ordinary people. In the steel box of a sunken tank, in the cold basement of a bombed-out city, or in a dark, flooded sewer beneath a world that was burning to the ground. And victory in such a battle is not a medal on the chest. It is a quiet, unremarkable life after death, with the eternal echo of screams in your memory.